My husband pointed to the front door during his family's lavish Thanksgiving dinner and gave me a final ultimatum. Apologize to his mother and sign away my inheritance or get out. I did not argue or shed a single tear. I simply packed my bags, took our 3-year-old son, and bought 2 one-way tickets to Geneva. He sneered that he was freezing our joint accounts, assuming I would be begging to come back by midnight. He had no idea that 3 hours later, his entire family would be the ones panicking as they realized I was the one who held the keys to their entire financial empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The dining room inside Bishop Thomas and Sylvia's multi-million-dollar Chicago estate was suffocatingly warm. Crystal chandeliers cast a harsh glare over the roasted turkey and silver platters that adorned the mahogany table. I sat quietly at the end of the table, focusing on cutting a small piece of sweet potato for my 3-year-old son, Miles. I had spent the last 5 years of my marriage shrinking myself to fit into the background of this powerful, influential family. They were the royalty of the local church community, projecting an image of absolute perfection and divine favor. But behind closed doors, their grace was entirely conditional. The tension in the room shifted when Spencer cleared his throat. Spencer was my sister-in-law, Alicia's husband, a venture capitalist who always carried himself with an unearned sense of superiority. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a thick legal document, and slid it directly over my plate of food. The heavy paper landed with a dull thud right on top of my cranberry sauce. I looked down at the bold print. It was a property transfer deed. "I need you to sign this," Valerie Spencer said, his tone casual, as if he were asking me to pass the salt. "It transfers the title of that old commercial lot your grandfather left you over to my investment firm. We need to collateralize some new assets by Monday morning." I stared at the deed, my heart pounding against my ribs. My grandfather had worked his entire life to buy that small lot in the city. It was the only thing I had left of him. "Why would I sign over my inheritance to your company?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully level. My mother-in-law, Sylvia, scoffed from the head of the table. She adjusted her expensive pearls and looked at me with open disdain. "Do not be difficult, Valerie. Spencer is saving this family's financial portfolio. He is securing our legacy. The least you can do is contribute that worthless piece of dirt your grandfather left behind. It is not like your silly computer hobby is bringing any real money into this house." Her words were a deliberate insult. To them, I was just a glorified tech support worker doing freelance gigs from home. They had no idea that my silly computer hobby was actually a position as the lead forensic financial architect for a global cybersecurity firm. I made more in a month than Devin made in a year, but I kept my wealth hidden to avoid their endless demands for loans and church donations. Devin, my husband of 5 years, leaned over and grabbed my wrist. His grip was tight enough to bruise a physical warning to comply. "Sign it, Valerie," he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Your little freelance gigs do not pay the country club dues or keep up our lifestyle. Spencer is family. We all make sacrifices for the greater good. Stop embarrassing me and just sign the paper." I looked at the man I had married. The man who had promised to protect and cherish me, now acting as an enforcer for his brother-in-law's schemes. I gently but firmly pulled my wrist out of his grasp. I picked up a napkin and wiped a smear of cranberry sauce off the legal document. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice ringing clearly across the silent dining room. "Especially not to collateralize a firm that is currently hiding a $2 million deficit." The color drained from Spencer's face. He knocked over his wine glass, sending a dark red stain spreading across Sylvia's pristine white tablecloth. "What are you talking about?" Spencer stammered, his confident facade cracking. "You do not know anything about my firm. I know that you have been moving investor funds to offshore shell companies for the past 6 months," I replied calmly. "I know that you are facing a massive margin call on Monday, and you are desperate for any tangible asset to offer the bank so they do not alert the federal authorities. You do not want my grandfather's lot to build a legacy. You want it to save yourself from prison." Sylvia gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. Bishop Thomas slammed his fist down on the table, rattling the expensive china. "How dare you speak to your brother-in-law that way?" the bishop roared. "You come into my home, eat my food, and disrespect the man who is trying to elevate this family. You are a paranoid, ungrateful woman." Devin stood up his chair, scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking finger toward the front door. "Apologize to Spencer and my mother right now, or get out," he shouted. "I will not have my wife acting like a lunatic at Thanksgiving dinner. Apologize or leave Valerie." I looked around the table at the faces of the people who were supposed to be my family. There was no love here, only calculation and control. They expected me to break down, to cry, to beg for forgiveness, and sign away my grandfather's memory just to keep the peace. That was what the old Valerie would have done. But that woman no longer existed. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly stood up, pushed my chair in, and picked up Miles, who was watching the shouting with wide, frightened eyes. I wiped a crumb from my son's cheek and looked directly at Devin. "Enjoy the turkey," I said. I walked out of the dining room without looking back. I went straight to the hall closet, grabbed our coats, and headed out the front door. The crisp November air hit my face, clearing away the suffocating atmosphere of the mansion. As I strapped Miles into his car seat, Devin burst out onto the front porch. He was furious, realizing that his ultimate threat had not worked. "Where do you think you are going?" he yelled, marching down the driveway. "You cannot just walk out on me. I am freezing our joint accounts right now. Every credit card, every checking account is locked. You will be completely broke. You will be begging to come back by midnight." I closed the car door and turned to face him. He looked so arrogant, so completely certain that he held all the power over me. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my banking application. I had spent years quietly untangling my finances from his, moving my substantial income into private offshore accounts and creating a digital fortress around my assets. I tapped a single button on my screen, executing a protocol I had prepared for this exact scenario. The command immediately severed his access to everything I owned and locked down the administrative privileges on his own company network, which I had built for him from the ground up. "Do what you have to do, Devin," I said, climbing into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove away, leaving him standing in the cold driveway. He thought he was cutting me off. He had absolutely no idea that by the time his turkey was cold, he would be entirely locked out of his own life. The chaotic hum of O'Hare International Airport felt like a soothing balm compared to the toxic atmosphere I had just left behind. I steered my luggage cart with one hand while keeping a firm grip on Miles with the other. My phone vibrated endlessly against my hip. I finally pulled it out. Devin had sent 34 text messages in the span of 45 minutes. The first few were exactly what I expected. "You are making a huge mistake, Valerie. Come back right now and apologize, or I swear I am changing the locks." But as I read down the screen, the tone shifted dramatically. The arrogance dissolved into outright panic. "Why is my card declining at the gas station? Valerie, answer me right now." My phone vibrated again. Devin calling. I silenced it and slid the device back into my pocket. As I approached the first-class check-in counter, I handed my passport and Miles' documents to the attendant. She smiled warmly, an expression of genuine kindness that I had not seen from anyone in my husband's family in 5 years. While she processed our tickets, a memory flashed in my mind, sharp and bitter. 4 years ago, my mother passed away suddenly. I was devastated, packing my bags to fly home for her funeral when Devin had grabbed my suitcase. "You cannot leave right now," he had said, his voice laced with annoyance. "The alumni gala is this weekend. I need you there on my arm." How will it look if my wife skips the most important networking event of the year? I had begged him, crying, telling him it was my mother. He had simply walked out of the room, telling me to make the right choice for our future. I stayed. I missed my mother's funeral to stand beside him in a sequin dress, smiling for his fraternity brothers. I vowed right then, standing at the airport counter, that I would never, ever compromise myself for that man again. My little computer hobby, as Sylvia called it, was not a hobby at all. For the past 4 years, while Devin thought I was doing low-paying freelance design work, I had been operating as the lead forensic financial architect for a global cybersecurity firm based in Geneva. I traced stolen funds, dismantled digital embezzlement rings, and secured billions of dollars for international clients. Devin and his family were so obsessed with their country club status and megachurch optics that they never bothered to actually ask what I did all day. They assumed because I worked from home in sweatpants that my work was worthless. I settled into my seat on the plane, Miles already dozing peacefully next to me. The flight attendant offered me a glass of champagne, and I accepted it, taking a slow, deliberate sip. I opened my laptop and connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi. The digital locks I had placed on Devin's accounts were holding perfectly. He was completely cut off from the wealth I had quietly accumulated and hidden behind layers of encrypted security. He thought he was the provider, but he had been living on my money for years. 3 hours later, midway over the Atlantic, I closed my laptop and watched the dark ocean below. Back in Chicago, the Thanksgiving dinner was still happening. I could imagine the scene perfectly. Bishop Thomas pontificating at the head of the table, Sylvia nodding along in her designer dress, Devin drinking scotch and pretending he wasn't internally panicking about his declined credit cards. Suddenly, Spencer's phone rang, shattering the practiced elegance of their dinner. He answered it, waving a hand dismissively at the table to signal it was business. But as he listened, his face drained of color. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. His hand shook so violently that the wine glass he was holding slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Red wine pooled around his expensive shoes, looking uncomfortably like blood. "Spencer, what is it?" Alicia demanded, standing up. "What is wrong?" Spencer stared at the phone in his hand, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "Our corporate accounts," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "They are gone. All of them. The overseas parent company just liquidated us. Every single dollar has been pulled. We have absolutely nothing left." Devin froze his fork halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean liquidated? Who authorized that?" Spencer looked at his brother-in-law, terror in his eyes. "The primary shareholder. The firm that just bought out our debt this morning. And who is that?" Bishop Thomas demanded, his pastoral authority completely gone. Spencer swallowed hard. "I do not know. The contact name on the transfer order is listed as a secured foreign entity. They wiped us out in less than 10 seconds. The dining room descended into absolute chaos. Alicia started screaming that her life was ruined. Sylvia clutched her pearls, demanding that Devin fix this immediately. Devin pulled out his phone frantically, trying to call his bank, his broker, anyone who could explain what was happening. But every number he dialed went straight to an automated message stating his accounts were suspended pending investigation. As the plane hummed toward Geneva, I reclined my seat and closed my eyes. The turbulence they were experiencing was just beginning. They had demanded I sign away my grandfather's legacy to save their fraudulent empire. They had called me socially unfit and an embarrassment to their pristine image. They had no idea that the quiet, obedient wife they had spent 5 years belittling was the exact same secured foreign entity that had just burned their empire to the ground. I sat in the quiet cabin of the plane, watching the digital logs scroll across my laptop screen. Every keystroke, every frantic attempt to access the network back in Chicago was recorded in real time. I did not need to be in the dining room to know exactly how the scene was unfolding, because Devin was documenting his own demise through a barrage of panicked voicemails. His messages popped up on my screen one after another, painting a vivid picture of the chaos I had left behind. He was no longer the arrogant man who had ordered me out of his house. His voice was high and breathless, echoing with the sound of breaking glass and shouting in the background. Spencer had turned on him the second the overseas parent company liquidated the firm. Through the distorted audio of Devin's voicemails, I could hear Spencer screaming that Devin must have tipped off the federal authorities. Spencer was pacing the dining room, stepping over the shattered remains of his wine glass, demanding to know who else knew about the offshore accounts. He accused Devin of selling him out to save his own skin. Devin was practically crying into the phone, begging me to unfreeze his personal debit cards so he could just leave the house. He told me Spencer was looking at him like a caged animal, but Devin always had a desperate need to play the hero for his family. He wanted his father's approval more than he wanted air to breathe. I watched the server logs as Devin made his next move. He told Spencer to calm down. He promised he would just log into the Bishop's family trust and wire enough money to cover the margin call before the banks opened on Monday morning. I sipped my champagne as I watched Devin's login credentials ping the main server. He typed in his password expecting to see the millions of dollars his father had hoarded from the church congregation over the past decade. Instead, he hit the digital brick wall I had erected weeks ago. Access denied. The family trust was completely frozen, entangled in a complex web of forensic audits I had triggered the moment my plane left the tarmac. The sound of Devin realizing the trust was gone was captured perfectly in his next voicemail. I heard him frantically tapping his keyboard, his breathing heavy. Then came the dead silence followed by his sister Alicia's piercing scream. Alicia had built her entire identity on being the perfect wealthy church daughter. She was a prominent member of the elite Jack and Jill Society, hosting charity galas, and looking down on women like me who actually worked for a living. When Devin admitted that the family trust was locked and Spencer's firm was bankrupt, the pristine facade of their holy empire cracked wide open. I heard the sharp crack of a physical blow through the phone speaker. Alicia had slapped Devin right across the face. She was sobbing hysterically, screaming that her reputation was ruined. She wailed that she would be a laughingstock at the country club and that her society friends would turn their backs on her the second the news broke. There was no prayer, no faith, no relying on the grace of God that Bishop Thomas preached about every Sunday morning. Their entire religion was built on money and status, and without it, they were tearing each other apart. The bishop was yelling in the background, demanding that Devin fix the computer glitch, while Sylvia sobbed about having to cancel her upcoming luxury cruise. Devin could not handle the humiliation of his family turning against him. He needed a scapegoat, and since I had just walked out the door, I was the easiest target. His voicemails shifted from panicked begging to vicious threats. He told me he knew I was behind the locked accounts because I was a vindictive, jealous woman. He said he was hiring a private investigator to hunt me down. He promised to spend every last dime he had to drag me back to Chicago and throw me in a jail cell. He did not seem to realize that he did not have a single dime left to spend. When the threats did not force me to answer my phone, Devin decided to escalate the situation. He left a final chilling message telling me that he had just dialed emergency services. He told the dispatcher that his mentally unstable wife had stolen his car, drained his bank accounts, and kidnapped his 3-year-old son. He played the role of the distraught father, perfectly hoping to use the police to track my passport and intercept me at the border. He wanted to frame me as a crazy runaway wife, to cover up the massive financial crimes his family had been committing for years. He told me the police were on their way to the mansion right that very second and that I would be in handcuffs by morning. I felt a brief flash of maternal fear as I looked at Miles sleeping softly next to me, but the fear quickly washed away. I had sole legal custody documents in my bag signed by a judge months ago when I first discovered Devin's infidelity and financial abuse. I was completely protected from his desperate lies. I simply leaned back in my seat and let the gentle hum of the airplane soothe my tired mind. Back in Chicago, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the massive columns of the bishop's estate. I would later read the official police report detailing exactly what happened next. Devin rushed to the heavy oak front doors, throwing them open with a look of pure relief. He expected to see local officers ready to take his fabricated kidnapping report and issue an Amber Alert for my son. He expected to play the wealthy victim and send the authorities after me. But the men standing on the porch were not local police responding to a domestic dispute. They were wearing dark windbreakers with federal insignias printed across the back. They pushed past a stunned Devin without even asking for his name. They walked straight into the dining room where the family was still arguing over the ruined turkey. The lead agent did not look at the bishop or Sylvia or Alicia. He looked directly at Spencer, who was sweating through his custom-tailored suit. The agent announced that they had a federal warrant to seize all of Spencer's electronic devices, cell phones, and hard drives regarding a massive ongoing investigation into international wire fraud. By Sunday morning, the panic in Chicago had morphed into a calculated counterattack. Sylvia did not become the matriarch of a megachurch empire by letting a crisis go to waste. She knew the federal raid on her son-in-law's electronics would generate whispers among the elite circles, so she orchestrated a massive smear campaign to control the narrative. The easiest way to protect the family was to turn me into a monster. I sat in my sleek glass office in Geneva, thousands of miles away from their toxicity, and watched the Sunday service live stream on my secondary monitor. The production value of the broadcast was flawless. The camera panned over thousands of devoted congregants sitting in plush velvet seats while the massive choir swayed in the background. Bishop Thomas stepped up to the acrylic podium, looking solemn and exhausted. He did not wear his usual vibrant robes. Instead, he wore a simple dark suit to project humility and heartbreak. He gripped the edges of the podium and let out a heavy rehearsed sigh that echoed through the sound system. He told his congregation that the devil was attacking his family. He squeezed his eyes shut and managed to produce a single perfect tear that rolled down his cheek. He announced to the silent auditorium that his daughter-in-law had suffered a severe mental break. He shamelessly threw around medical terms he did not understand, claiming I was suffering from delayed postpartum psychosis, even though Miles was already 3 years old. He told the people watching that I had become completely delusional and dangerous. He painted Devin as a tragic, devoted husband who had spent years trying to get me the psychological help I so desperately needed. The bishop claimed that during Thanksgiving dinner my fragile mind finally shattered. He said I had stolen a vehicle, drained their personal accounts in a fit of paranoia, and kidnapped his precious grandson, Miles. The camera cut to the front row, where Sylvia was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She leaned her head against Devin's shoulder, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Devin stared blankly at the floor, looking traumatized while secretly hiding his financial terror. Watching them weave this elaborate web of lies, I felt a strange sense of detachment. A few years ago, hearing my name dragged through the mud in front of the entire church would have broken me. I would have been terrified of the judgment. The camera scanned the faces of the congregation, capturing their gasps and sympathetic murmurs. Women who had spent years ignoring me at church functions were now shaking their heads in fake pity, whispering to each other about my craziness. They loved the drama. It validated every cruel thought they ever had about the quiet girl who never quite fit into their glamorous circles. The intense pressure of church politics meant that they would eagerly devour this story and cast me out without a second thought. But sitting in my quiet office with Miles safely playing with his new nanny in the adjoining room, I did not feel an ounce of shame. I felt cold, calculated determination. Their smear campaign was a desperate smokescreen to distract from the reality that their entire empire was crumbling. The heavy oak door of my office clicked open, and my European business partner Liam walked in. He paused for a moment, looking at the church broadcast playing on my monitor. He did not ask about the sermon. He already knew exactly what kind of people my in-laws were, because he had helped me build the digital traps that caught them. Liam walked silently across the room and slid a small silver flash drive across my pristine glass desk. It stopped right next to my coffee cup. He looked at me and said the decryption finished 10 minutes ago. We pulled every deleted file before the federal agents even walked through their front door. The drive contains the exact offshore routing numbers Spencer used to move the funds before you locked him out. I nodded and picked up the drive, feeling the cold metal against my palm. I plugged it into my workstation and brought up the forensic architecture software. This was what I did best. I bypassed the encrypted security walls that Spencer thought would keep him safe. I watched the digital trail unfold across my screen, a massive tangled web of shell companies located in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. Spencer had been desperate. His venture capital firm was bleeding money, and he had been siphoning millions to cover his massive deficit. He thought he could hide the transfers through dummy corporations, but digital money always leaves a footprint if you know exactly where to look. I traced the massive $2 million deficit backward. Spencer was desperate for my grandfather's commercial lot because he needed fresh collateral to cover the gaping hole in his accounts. But as I followed the initial flow of the stolen money, a new discrepancy caught my eye. The capital Spencer had been quietly draining over the past 6 months did not come from his wealthy private investors. It did not come from corporate clients or hedge funds. I cracked the final layer of encryption hiding the origin accounts, and the true source of the money populated on my screen. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The money Spencer was embezzling belonged to the church. It was the megachurch building fund. It was the dedicated charity accounts meant for the local orphanage. It was the weekly tithes collected from the very same congregation that was currently weeping over the bishop's fake tears. Spencer had been stealing millions directly from the church to keep his failing venture capital firm afloat. But Spencer could not have accessed those highly restricted church accounts on his own. He needed an inside man. He needed someone with absolute administrative authority over the church financial portfolio. I ran a final query to extract the digital authorization signatures attached to every single fraudulent transfer. My screen flashed green as the results populated. Every single time money moved from the church charity funds to Spencer's offshore shell companies, a specific digital signature approved the transaction. I leaned closer to the monitor, staring at the undeniable proof staring back at me. The signature on the transfer approvals did not belong to Devin. It did not belong to Sylvia. The digital authorization matching every single stolen dime belonged directly to Bishop Thomas. Staring at the bishop's digital signature glowing on my monitor, I realized that that single piece of evidence shifted my entire plan from simple exposure to complete financial acquisition. The holy and untouchable bishop was not just covering up for his son-in-law, but he was the primary architect of the embezzlement. I sat back in my leather chair and took a slow breath, letting the reality of their corruption wash over me. Liam stood silently across the glass desk, waiting for my next command. I did not hesitate. I told him to initiate the final buyout protocol. Spencer's venture capital firm was bleeding out and drowning in the massive deficit they had created by stealing from the church orphanage fund. The banks were preparing to seize everything by Monday, but I had the capital to buy their debt first. My cybersecurity firm did not just protect assets, we absorbed compromised entities. Liam tapped his tablet and the official acquisition papers populated on my massive screen. Reading through the dense legal jargon, I felt a profound sense of justice taking shape. By purchasing the toxic debt of Spencer's firm, my company would immediately become his primary creditor and majority stakeholder. I would essentially own him. I would own the very firm that my husband and his family praised as the absolute pinnacle of their financial success. I picked up the heavy silver pen on my desk and signed my name on the digital glass, locking in the purchase. The transfer was instantaneous. A notification flashed verifying that the global parent company now held exclusive rights to every remaining asset Spencer had to his name. I was officially his boss and the sole dictator of his financial future. I stood up from the desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. The Geneva skyline stretched out before me, bathed in the soft golden light of the late afternoon sun. The snow-capped mountains in the distance looked peaceful and unbothered, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I was raining down on Chicago. Looking down at the pristine streets below, I allowed myself a moment to remember the long, miserable nights I had spent building this empire from the ground up. I remembered sitting at the small, cramped desk in the corner of our master bedroom back in Chicago, typing endless lines of complex code while Devin got dressed for his elite social events. He would stand in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting his expensive silk ties and laughing at my glowing screens. He would call me a glorified it girl and tell me that staring at computers all night would ruin my eyesight and age my skin. He would remind me that his family was the backbone of the community and that I was lucky they had allowed me into their prestigious circle. He demanded that I focus more on hosting church luncheons and less on my silly little tech projects. He never bothered to ask what those projects actually were. If he had ever stopped talking about himself long enough to listen, he might have realized that his glorified it girl was actively designing the financial security architecture for some of the wealthiest corporations in Europe. He mocked my ambition because he was too arrogant to understand it. Now that same ambition had just purchased his entire family legacy for pennies on the dollar. The satisfying silence of my office was suddenly broken by the sharp chime of an incoming email. I walked back to my desk and glanced at the monitor. The sender address belonged to a high-profile family law attorney based in Chicago, the same attorney who regularly golfed with Devin and the bishop on Sunday afternoons. My heart executed a painful stutter as I opened the message. The subject line read, "Urgent Notice of Emergency Custody Hearing." I scanned the contents of the email and felt a cold wave of fury radiate through my veins. Devin had not just filed a false police report claiming I had kidnapped our son. He had escalated his vicious lies to the family court system. The lawyer had drafted a lengthy and aggressive document petitioning the court for an emergency physical custody order. The email stated that Devin was requesting immediate and sole custody of Miles based on my severe psychological instability and erratic behavior. The document was filled with vicious fabrications provided by Sylvia and Alicia, detailing bizarre fictional episodes where I had supposedly endangered my son in front of the entire congregation. The attorney boldly claimed that I had fled the country in a manic state and posed an active physical threat to my own child. The bottom of the email contained the ultimate threat. An emergency hearing had been scheduled before a judge for this coming Friday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. The lawyer stated in plain, aggressive language that if I failed to appear in person to contest the motion, the judge would automatically grant Devin full custody by default. They would flag my passport and issue an international warrant for my arrest regarding child endangerment. Devin thought he had me completely cornered. He assumed I was hiding in a cheap hotel somewhere, terrified and broke. He believed that threatening to take Miles away would shatter my resolve and force me to crawl back to Chicago begging for mercy. He expected me to panic and surrender. Instead, I calmly opened a secure encrypted folder on my private server. I had spent years meticulously gathering evidence of Devin's true character, preparing for the day he might try to use our son as a pawn. I scrolled past the massive files containing his financial irregularities and selected a specific subfolder labeled Joint Account Anomalies. Devin thought he was so clever hiding his activities, but he consistently used our shared funds to finance his personal indiscretions, assuming I was too stupid to read a bank statement. I selected a high-resolution photograph from the file. It was a crystal-clear image taken from a security feed at a luxury hotel downtown. The timestamp in the corner of the photo showed it was taken just 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday afternoon when Devin was supposedly attending a mandatory church leadership retreat. The image showed Devin standing at the hotel check-in counter with his arm wrapped tightly around the waist of the head choir director from Bishop Thomas' congregation. He was handing the concierge the platinum credit card linked directly to our joint checking account. The choir director was leaning into his shoulder laughing while holding a small overnight bag. It was undeniable proof of his infidelity, financed entirely by my money. I attached the single document file to the reply email. I did not bother drafting a long emotional response defending my sanity or my rights as a mother. I did not waste my breath arguing against the fabricated kidnapping charges. Devin and his lawyer wanted to play a high-stakes game of intimidation, and I was more than ready to oblige them. I typed a simple 3-word response below the attached photograph. See you Friday. I hit send, watched the progress bar complete, and closed the laptop screen. Devin wanted a war in the courtroom, and I was going to bring him an absolute massacre. I was going to burn his pristine reputation to ash and let his own congregation watch the smoke rise. The email I sent to Devin's lawyer sat quietly in his inbox, a ticking time bomb waiting to decimate his arrogant threats. While Devin was spiraling into a pit of his own making over the custody hearing, Spencer and Alicia were fighting a completely different war inside the walls of the bishop's estate. The federal raid had stripped Spencer of his laptops, his phones, and his dignity, but the agents had left him behind, pending a formal grand jury indictment. He was a man backed into a corner, staring down decades in a federal penitentiary for embezzling the church building funds. He knew the only way to survive the coming legal slaughter was to hire the most ruthless and expensive white-collar defense attorneys in the city. But his accounts were frozen, his credit was destroyed, and my digital locks held his remaining offshore funds hostage. Spencer was suffocating, and desperate men always make careless mistakes. He paced the length of the bishop's luxurious living room, his shoes sinking into the imported Persian rugs. Alicia sat on the velvet sofa watching him with wide, terrified eyes. Her pristine world of country club luncheons and charity galas was collapsing around her. Spencer stopped pacing and looked at his wife, a dark, calculated gleam returning to his eyes. He told her there was one last lifeline, one piece of untouched capital that the federal agents did not know about yet. He reminded Alicia about the commercial lot my grandfather had left me in the warehouse district. It was a prime piece of real estate sitting completely unencumbered. Spencer explained that he knew a shady private developer who specialized in distressed assets and quiet transactions. The developer would not ask questions, and he would pay cash immediately if they offered the property at a steep discount. Alicia looked at him in confusion, asking how they could sell a property that did not belong to them. Spencer walked over and gripped her shoulders, telling her that they simply needed Valerie's signature on the deed transfer documents. He looked her dead in the eye and told her she had to forge it. Alicia recoiled physically, pulling away from him. The reality of committing a blatant felony terrified her. She stormed out of the living room and marched straight into the massive chef's kitchen, where Sylvia was frantically brewing chamomile tea to calm her own nerves. Alicia slammed her hands down on the marble island, throwing a massive tantrum. She complained bitterly to her mother about Spencer asking her to do the dirty work. She whined that she was a respected society woman, a beloved daughter of the church, and that she should not have to stoop to the level of a common criminal. She cried that this entire nightmare was Devon's fault for marrying a worthless woman who did not understand family loyalty. Sylvia did not scold her daughter for considering fraud. Instead, she walked over and stroked Alicia's perfectly styled hair, soothing her just like she had done for 30 years. Sylvia had raised Alicia as the ultimate golden child, teaching her that the rules of the world simply did not apply to people with their level of anointing and social status. Sylvia reminded Alicia that consequences were for ordinary people. She softly recounted the time in high school, when Alicia had wrecked a luxury car while driving intoxicated, and Sylvia had seamlessly manipulated the situation so Devon took the entire blame. She reminded her daughter how she had silenced the church elders when Alicia was caught skimming from the youth ministry fund in college. Sylvia pulled Alicia close and whispered that a little signature was just a means to an end to protect the family empire. She told her that the Lord understood their intentions and would provide grace for whatever they needed to do to survive. Emboldened by her mother's toxic validation and completely detached from the reality of consequences, Alicia marched into the bishop's private study. She retrieved the deed transfer documents Spencer had hastily printed. She rummaged through a drawer of old correspondence until she found a Christmas card I had signed several years ago. Gripping a heavy gold fountain pen, Alicia carefully traced the loops and curves of my name onto the legal documents. She did not feel guilt. She felt a sick thrill of power. She genuinely believed she was outsmarting the vindictive woman who had frozen their accounts. Spencer took the forged document straight to his contact in the city. The developer was a ruthless man who thrived on desperate sellers, and he barely glanced at the ink on the signature line. He only cared about acquiring a multi-million-dollar commercial lot for a fraction of its true market value. They shook hands in a dimly lit office smelling of stale cigar smoke. Within hours, a wire transfer of $500,000 hit a secondary offshore account Spencer had managed to keep hidden from the initial federal sweep. Sitting in his luxury sedan, Spencer stared at the banking app on a cheap burner phone. The numbers stared back at him, $500,000 in untraceable funds. A massive wave of relief washed over him, and he let out a breathless laugh, slapping the steering wheel in pure triumph. He felt the adrenaline rushing through his veins. He truly thought he had won. He believed he could use the down payment to hire the elite defense team he needed to crush the federal embezzlement charges. He was already plotting how he would spin the entire scandal to pin the blame on Devon or the clueless church board. He smiled to himself, thinking that Valerie was stupid for leaving such a valuable asset unprotected. But I was never stupid. Sitting in my pristine office in Geneva, I had anticipated their exact level of desperation. I knew the fundamental truth about greedy people: when they are backed into a corner, they will always try to steal whatever is left on the table. The commercial lot was not an oversight, it was the perfect bait. Weeks ago, before I even boarded the plane, I had worked with a trusted network of real estate attorneys to place a highly sophisticated federal fraud trap on the title of that specific property. Any attempt to transfer, sell, or borrow against that deed without my in-person biometric verification would immediately and silently trigger an alert directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Spencer and Alicia had not outsmarted me. They had walked willingly into a financial bear trap. Monday morning arrived in Chicago with a heavy, bitter downpour. Spencer pulled his car up to the elite private wealth branch of his bank downtown. He straightened his expensive silk tie, checking his reflection in the glass doors before pushing them open. He walked up to the teller counter, exuding the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. He slid his gold identification card across the polished marble counter and smoothly requested a cashier's check for the massive retainer fee required by his new lay. Breathing heavily, the bishop abandoned the broken shredder and threw himself into his leather desk chair. He told Sylvia to calm down, stating that the physical papers were just a backup anyway. He said he would simply log into the secure administrative server and wipe the primary digital hard drives clean. He reasoned that without the digital trail, the federal authorities could never definitively prove where the money had gone or who had authorized the transfers. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed the highly encrypted financial subfolders. Sylvia stood behind him, gripping the back of his chair so tightly her knuckles popped, watching the large flat monitor with desperate anticipation. The bishop clicked on the master directory, expecting to see thousands of highly sensitive financial logs and wire transfer histories. But the screen was completely blank. He clicked the mouse, frantically opening folder after folder, but every single one was completely empty. There were no records, no offshore routing numbers, no hidden ledgers. The entire administrative server had been completely wiped clean. Sylvia let out a strangled gasp, asking him where the files were. The bishop stared at the empty screen, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized in that terrifying moment that Valerie's cybersecurity firm did not just protect corporate assets, they extracted them. Weeks ago, while they were busy mocking my submissive persona, I had silently and remotely cloned every single server in the building before erasing the originals. I had possessed their entire financial history before they even knew they were at war. The heavy oak doors of the administrative office suddenly clicked as a key turned in the lock from the outside. Sylvia and the bishop froze instantly, spinning around to face the entrance. The doors swung open slowly, and a group of 5 men in dark suits walked into the lavish office. It was the entire church board of deacons, the men who legally oversaw the church's operations and governance. But they were not alone. I stepped out from behind them, walking calmly into the center of the room. I was wearing the same sharp, dark suit from the courthouse, looking completely unbothered by the chaos of the shredded papers scattered across the floor. The bishop tried to speak, to muster his booming, authoritative voice, to demand why they were interrupting his private work. but no words came out. He just stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute ruin. The head deacon, a stern, respected man who had trusted the bishop for decades, stepped forward, holding a thick stack of printed documents. He did not look at the bishop with reverence or respect. He looked at him with profound disgust. He held up the papers, the exact digital files I had cloned from their servers. "Bishop," he said, his voice echoing coldly in the lavish office care, to explain why the orphanage fund was wired to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. The head deacon dropping the papers in the bishop's office was the catalyst that finally shattered the Holy Empire. While the bishop was busy stammering and clutching his chest in a desperate attempt to fake a medical emergency, the real rat was already abandoning the sinking ship. Spencer had managed to scrape together just enough hidden cash to post his federal bail, and the moment his polished Italian shoes hit the pavement outside the detention center, he started plotting his own survival. He did not go home to comfort his terrified wife. He went straight to a bland, windowless conference room in the federal building. Sitting across from three stone-faced prosecutors, Spencer eagerly spilled every single secret the family had ever buried. He painted himself as an innocent, brilliant financial advisor who had been maliciously manipulated by the corrupt bishop and his greedy son Devon. He offered them the offshore routing numbers, the fake charity ledgers, and the names of every church elder who took a bribe. The prosecutors listened in absolute silence as Spencer traded his entire extended family for a guarantee of federal immunity. He threw Devon and the bishop entirely under the bus, detailing exact dates and times they had authorized the theft of the orphanage funds. He smiled while he signed the cooperation agreement, feeling absolutely no remorse for destroying the family that had given him his elevated status in the city. Back at their heavily mortgaged suburban mansion, Alicia was frantically tearing through Spencer's home office. She was desperately looking for anything of value to pawn: a hidden safe, a stack of emergency cash, a rare watch. The bank had just called to notify her that they were foreclosing on the house, and her perfectly manicured world was rapidly collapsing around her. She ripped the drawers out of his heavy mahogany desk, throwing expensive stationery and folders onto the floor in a blind panic. Instead of cash, she found a careless and devastating mistake. Spencer had left a printed draft of his federal immunity plea deal tucked inside a hollowed-out book on his bottom shelf. Alicia sank to the hardwood floor, reading the brutal legal jargon where her husband willingly offered her own father and brother to the FBI. But it was the attached printed emails between Spencer and his old fraternity brothers that truly broke her mind. The emails detailed exactly why Spencer had pursued her 5 years ago. He called her a naive, spoiled church girl who was the perfect Trojan horse. He mocked her vanity and bragged that marrying the bishop's daughter was his golden ticket to access the massive, unmonitored wealth of the congregation. He called her father a pompous fool, and her brother a weak, pathetic shadow of a man. Her perfect white knight had never loved her. He had only seen her as a gullible stepping stone for his elite investment scams. The realization that she was nothing but a pawn completely shattered Alicia's arrogant reality. Stripped of her pride and terrified of the coming federal storm, she did the only thing a desperate coward could do. She came crawling to me. The torrential rain was still punishing the city when Alicia buzzed the intercom at the secure underground entrance of my new penthouse. My security chief, Elena, made her wait in the freezing rain for 20 minutes before finally allowing her to ride the private elevator up to my floor. Alicia stepped out of the steel doors looking like a drowned rat. Her designer coat was soaked, her hair was plastered to her face, and her expensive makeup was running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She did not look like the untouchable golden child of the church anymore. Elena patted her down for recording devices, humiliating her further, before letting her walk into my space. Alicia walked into my massive living room, taking in the absolute sheer wealth of my environment. She immediately collapsed onto her knees, shivering and sobbing on my imported rugs. She begged me to call off the war. She pleaded for a truce, crying that the family was completely destroyed and that Devon was facing total ruin. She tried to appeal to my sense of compassion, begging me to remember that we used to be sisters. She admitted that Spencer had played them all, and that he was currently selling her father to the feds to save his own skin. Then she looked up at me with desperate red eyes and asked for a massive loan. The sheer audacity of her request almost made me laugh out loud. The woman who had spent years mocking my clothes, mocking my career, and treating me like an uneducated servant was now begging me for money to hire a ruthless divorce attorney. She promised she would pay me back every single penny if I just helped her escape the nightmare her life had become. I stood quietly near the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights blur through the heavy rain. I slowly turned around and looked down at her pathetic, trembling form. I did not offer her a towel, and I certainly did not offer her a tissue. I told her in a perfectly flat voice that I would not give her a single dime of my money. I reminded her that she had happily forged my signature on a commercial deed just days ago, trying to steal my grandfather's legacy to save her worthless husband. Alicia flinched and buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly that she was forced into it and that she did not know how evil Spencer truly was. I walked over to my glass desk and picked up a sleek black flash drive. I told Alicia that she was completely wrong about her husband. I explained that his financial crimes were absolutely nothing compared to the sickening secrets he kept locked away in the dark. I tossed the small piece of metal and plastic onto the floor right in front of her wet knees. I told her that when I cloned the church servers, I also gained total access to the private encrypted network Spencer kept hidden in their basement. I told her that Spencer was not going to federal prison for a simple embezzlement scheme. Just look at what he was really downloading on his private servers. Alicia slowly reached out and picked up the flash drive, her hands violently shaking. She dragged herself over to the guest laptop sitting on my side table and pushed the drive into the port. The screen immediately populated with hundreds of hidden file folders. Alicia clicked on the first one, and her eyes locked onto the screen. The color completely vanished from her face. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the entire penthouse. The heavy storm that had washed over Chicago finally broke, leaving the city streets slick and shimmering under the warm glow of the streetlights. I was sitting alone in a plush velvet booth at the Reserve, which was arguably the most exclusive and pretentious dining establishment in the entire city. The kind of place where the waiters wore white gloves, and the menus did not bother listing the prices. I had a glass of incredibly rare vintage wine resting in my hand, simply taking a moment to breathe and process the absolute destruction I had successfully unleashed upon the people who had tried to bury me. Devin was banned from seeing our son. The bishop was currently drowning in a federal investigation. Spencer had turned into a desperate rat, singing to the authorities to save his own miserable skin. My son Miles was finally safe, and my mind was incredibly clear. I took a slow sip of the rich red wine, letting the smooth jazz music wash over me. That delicate peace was violently shattered when Sylvia suddenly appeared, walking right past the frantic hostess and marching directly toward my private corner table. Seeing my mother-in-law in that moment was genuinely shocking. For the entire decade I had known her, Sylvia had always been the flawless, untouchable queen of the African-American elite. She had always commanded every room she entered with perfect posture and an intimidating glare. But the woman standing over my table right now looked absolutely unhinged. She was wearing one of her classic vintage Chanel suits, but it looked like she had slept in it. Her signature pearl necklace hung crookedly against her chest, and her eyes were wide and surrounded by dark, heavy bags that no amount of expensive foundation could hide. The stress of her husband facing indictment and her golden boy son losing his child had physically aged her 10 years in a matter of days. She did not wait for an invitation to sit. She slid aggressively into the booth across from me, her hands trembling so violently that she bumped the table and sent a small splash of my wine onto the pristine white tablecloth. She glared at me, breathing heavily as if she had just sprinted for blocks. Before I could even ask why she was interrupting my dinner, she reached into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a heavy black velvet jewelry box. She slammed it down onto the table right between us. She flipped the lid open with a sharp snap. Inside, resting on dark silk, was her absolute most prized possession. It was an antique diamond and sapphire necklace and matching earring set that had supposedly belonged to European royalty. She used to wear it exclusively to the mayor's private charity galas, using it as a glittering physical reminder to everyone else that she was infinitely superior to them. "Take it," Sylvia demanded, her voice a desperate, raspy whisper that cracked under the strain. "Take it all. Valerie, sell it, auction it. Keep it. I do not care. Just call off the forensic accountants, tell your proxy firms to drop the audits, and tell the federal prosecutors that you made a mistake with the digital servers. You have ruined enough lives already. You have taken my grandson away from my son. You have put my husband in the crosshairs of the FBI. This is worth at least $500,000. Take the jewels and walk away from us." I just stared at her, looking at the sparkling diamonds catching the low light of the restaurant. I slowly reached out and delicately picked up my wine glass, taking another calm sip. I did not look at the jewelry. I looked directly into her terrified, panicked eyes. Sylvia could not handle the quiet power dynamic. Her desperation instantly morphed back into the arrogant, condescending entitlement that had defined her entire miserable life. She leaned across the table, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "You owe me, Valerie," she hissed, venom dripping from every syllable. "You were absolutely nothing before you married into my family. You were just a basic, ordinary girl from a mediocre background with zero connections. I am the one who made you acceptable to high society. I taught you how to dress, how to speak to people of importance, and how to hold a wine glass without looking like a peasant. I opened the doors to the elite circles of Chicago for you. You would be completely invisible in this city if I had not personally stamped your social passport. You owe me this truce. Take the box and back off." Box. She sat back, breathing hard, fully expecting me to bow my head and accept her terms. She genuinely believed that her social standing still meant something. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her entire reality had already been burned to the ground. I did not raise my voice. I did not show any anger. I simply smiled, reached out and used one single finger to slowly slide the heavy velvet box right back across the table until it touched her plate. "I do not want your jewelry, Sylvia," I said, my voice perfectly flat and cold. "Mostly because I know for a factual certainty that you cannot afford to give it away." Her eyes widened in confusion, but I did not stop talking. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, and began reciting the exact numbers I had pulled from her hidden financial files. "You currently have exactly $84,000 in secret credit card debt spread across 5 different hidden accounts. You are 3 months behind on the mortgage payments for that massive suburban mansion you love so much. Your husband has been secretly draining the church's operational funds just to keep the lights on at your house. And tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, the board of directors at the Oak Brook Country Club is holding a special emergency vote to permanently revoke your membership due to unpaid luxury dues and the impending federal criminal indictments against your husband and your son-in-law." Sylvia's mouth fell open in sheer horror. The color drained from her face so completely she looked like a ghost sitting in a Chanel suit. Her entire identity, her entire social standing was built on the illusion of immense wealth and untouchable religious power. Hearing me casually list the exact details of her financial ruin in the middle of a crowded restaurant broke her brain. She began to shake uncontrollably, stammering and trying to deny the numbers, but the truth was suffocating her. "You are a monster!" she cried out, her voice rising in panic, drawing the attention of several nearby wealthy diners. "You cannot do this. I will have you thrown out of here. I know the owner of this establishment. I will have you humiliated and dragged out onto the street." She frantically raised her hand, waving wildly to get the attention of the restaurant manager. But I did not move a single muscle. I just sat back in my plush velvet seat and let her panic. I leaned in just a fraction closer to her, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "I do not want your jewels, Sylvia," I whispered softly. "But I did buy the commercial debt on this restaurant through one of my holding companies yesterday morning. You are trespassing on my personal property." Sylvia froze her arm, dropping slowly to her side, as the absolute magnitude of my power finally crushed whatever fight she had left in her. She realized she was not sitting across from the obedient, timid daughter-in-law she used to bully. She was sitting across from the woman who literally owned the ground she was standing on. I gave a subtle, brief nod to the general manager who had been watching the scene unfold from the entrance. Within seconds, two massive security guards in dark tailored suits appeared silently right behind Sylvia's chair. They each grabbed her by the arms, hauling her up from the booth. Sylvia began to shriek, kicking her expensive heels and sobbing hysterically as they physically dragged the former queen of Chicago high society right through the crowded, elegant dining room. She screamed my name over and over again, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. But I just picked up my wine glass and took another slow, quiet sip, completely at peace. The cold rain from the night before had left the industrial district of Chicago smelling like wet asphalt rust and decaying metal. Devin pulled the collar of his dark, expensive coat up over his head, shivering violently in the damp, bitter chill as he stood alone outside the rusted chain-link fence of my grandfather's old commercial lot. He was completely desperate, a drowning man grasping at straws. His personal bank accounts were completely frozen by the courts. His black luxury credit cards were declining at cheap fast food drive-thrus, and his high-priced divorce attorney had just officially dropped him as a client due to aggressive non-payment. In his panicked, rapidly spiraling mind, this abandoned brick building was his absolute last available lifeline. He vividly remembered my mother-in-law Sylvia, mocking this exact property for years, sitting at her lavish dinner table sipping imported wine and calling it a useless pile of rotting bricks that my working-class grandfather had stupidly and stubbornly clung to. Devin figured there had to be heavy copper wiring, old valuable manufacturing equipment, or at the very least raw structural materials inside that he could violently strip and fence for quick, untraceable cash. He needed money immediately to run far away before the federal indictments officially dropped on his head. He grabbed a heavy pair of industrial bolt cutters from the trunk of his leased luxury sedan, the exact same car the dealership was actively tracking and trying to repossess, and aggressively snapped the rusted padlock on the outer security gate. He slipped quickly through the deep shadows, moving stealthily toward the side entrance of the large, imposing brick warehouse. He found a weathered steel door that looked vulnerable and used a heavy iron crowbar to violently force it open, the old metal groaning and popping loudly in the dead quiet alleyway. He slipped inside quickly, pulling out his heavy tactical flashlight, expecting to see empty concrete floors, peeling lead paint, and the decaying, depressing remnants of a forgotten industrial era. Instead, the bright, harsh beam of his flashlight reflected off a massive, thick wall of reinforced tinted glass that stretched from the floor all the way up to the high ceiling. Devin lowered the flashlight, his mouth falling open in sheer absolute confusion. The interior of the supposedly abandoned warehouse had been completely gutted and flawlessly retrofitted with cutting-edge technology. Beyond the thick glass lay a massive, pristine, temperature-controlled room, illuminated by the soft, rhythmic blinking of thousands of blue and green LED lights. Rows upon rows of sleek black server racks hummed with a quiet, incredibly powerful vibration that he could feel thrumming right through the soles of his expensive leather shoes. He was standing inside a multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art server farm. It was the primary physical data hub for my elite cybersecurity company. While his arrogant family had spent the last decade mocking my humble background and laughing uncontrollably at my grandfather's seemingly worthless real estate inheritance, I had quietly and methodically transformed this industrial brick shell into the beating digital heart of a highly lucrative, untouchable tech empire. Devin pressed his trembling hands against the cold, thick glass, staring blankly at the endless rows of humming servers as the devastating reality fully washed over him. I was not just financially secure, I was a quiet, invisible titan. I possessed a level of hidden wealth and massive infrastructural power that his fake holy family could not even begin to comprehend, let alone rival. The sheer magnitude of my hidden success completely shattered his fragile, deeply arrogant ego. His entire pathetic life had been exclusively defined by the toxic belief that he was inherently superior to everyone around him simply because of his last name and the vast wealth of his father's megachurch. Whenever the real world had dared to deny him exactly what he wanted, he had always resorted to throwing violent, destructive temper tantrums, knowing with absolute certainty that his mother would quickly sweep in with her heavy checkbook to quietly pay for the damages and silence the victims. He instantly reverted to that exact same pathetic juvenile behavior right there in the cold, dark warehouse. He let out a guttural, high-pitched scream of pure childish rage and swung his heavy steel crowbar directly at the reinforced glass panel with all his might. The thick glass did not shatter completely, but a massive, deep spiderweb of jagged white cracks exploded loudly across the smooth surface. The violent, aggressive impact immediately triggered the building's advanced internal defense protocols. The soft blue and green lights inside the massive server room instantly flashed to a blinding, aggressive crimson red. A loud mechanical slamming sound echoed violently through the empty warehouse as the heavy steel door Devon had just forced open automatically slammed shut behind him, driven by a powerful hydraulic pneumatic lock. Devon spun around in terror, dropping the heavy crowbar as the crushing reality of his mistake fully set in. He sprinted blindly back to the door, frantically grabbing the cold metal handle and pulling with all his remaining adrenaline-fueled strength, but the solid steel did not budge a single millimeter. He was completely, permanently trapped inside the narrow outer containment vestibule. An automated, highly synthetic voice suddenly echoed from hidden speakers, mounted high in the warehouse ceiling, warning unauthorized structural impact detected perimeter breach. Confirmed lockdown protocols engaged. Local law enforcement has been immediately dispatched to this location. Please remain in the containment zone. Devon began to panic violently, his breathing turning into frantic, shallow, wheezing gasps. He knew he absolutely could not be caught trespassing inside my private corporate property, especially armed with a crowbar and heavy bolt cutters. A breaking and entering felony charge, combined with his existing federal fraud investigations and the strict restraining order the family court judge had just issued, would instantly guarantee him decades locked away in a federal penitentiary. He frantically scanned the small, dimly lit vestibule, his desperate eyes landing on a heavy red fire extinguisher securely mounted in a glass emergency box on the far brick wall. He smashed the safety glass violently with his bare elbow, completely ignoring the sharp burning sting of the deep cuts, and grabbed the heavy red metal cylinder. He sprinted toward a narrow frosted ventilation window located high up near the ceiling of the outer brick wall, facing the dark alley. Using the heavy fire extinguisher like a desperate battering ram, he swung it with panicked, terrifying force, shattering the thick frosted glass into a loud shower of sharp, deadly fragments. He hoisted himself up frantically, grabbing the jagged, bleeding edges of the window frame, tearing his expensive tailored suit jacket, and slicing open his soft palms as he aggressively forced his heavy body through the narrow opening. He tumbled awkwardly out into the freezing wet alleyway, crashing hard and violently onto the unforgiving wet pavement below. He groaned loudly, clutching his heavily bruised ribs, and scrambled desperately to get to his knees, his hands slipping in the cold, muddy water. The bright, sweeping flash of approaching headlights suddenly illuminated the dark, narrow alley, blinding him temporarily. Devon froze instantly, kneeling in the dirty, freezing puddles, as three dark, unmarked sedans screeched to a sudden halt, effectively blocking both ends of the narrow street so he could not run. Heavy car doors flew open simultaneously, but the flashing lights illuminating the brick walls were not the familiar red and blue of the local Chicago Police Department responding to a standard alarm. They were solid, aggressive, pulsing blue. Heavy combat boots hit the wet pavement with loud, synchronous thuds as stern-faced federal agents stepped out of the vehicles, pulling on dark, heavy windbreakers, with three massive yellow letters printed clearly and brightly across the back, IRS. The cold, harsh reality of the IRS windbreakers, illuminated by the flashing blue police lights, finally broke whatever tiny sliver of delusion Devon still possessed. He was shivering violently in the mud, bleeding from his hands and face, babbling incoherent excuses to the federal agents, who were already yanking his arms behind his back and slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. They did not care about his father's church or his elite country club memberships. They read him his rights in a flat mechanical tone and shoved his soaking wet, ruined tailored suit into the back of a freezing police cruiser. Devon spent the entire night locked in a freezing holding cell, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, completely stripped of his designer clothes and his fake holy dignity. He wept silently in the dark corner of the concrete cell, waiting for the dawn to break. That was only the preamble to the absolute massacre that was scheduled for the very next morning. Wednesday broke with crystal-clear skies over Chicago, setting the perfect stage for the most beautifully synchronized legal strike in the history of the city. I had spent weeks coordinating with multiple federal agencies, forensic accountants, and private process servers to ensure that nobody in that corrupt family would have even a single second to warn the others. At exactly 8 in the morning, a small army of black SUVs rolled simultaneously into the most exclusive neighborhoods of the city. Out in the affluent, pristine suburbs, Sylvia and the bishop were sitting down to their lavish catered breakfast, completely unaware that their holy empire was about to be burned to the ground on their own front lawn. 3 federal vehicles aggressively parked, blocking their massive circular driveway. Agents wearing heavy tactical gear poured out and marched right up to the custom mahogany front doors. They did not knock politely. They banged on the heavy wood with a force that echoed through the entire wealthy cul-de-sac. When the bishop haughtily opened the door, expecting to yell at some confused delivery driver, he was immediately met with a wall of federal badges and a thick stack of federal subpoenas. Sylvia ran out to the porch wearing her silk morning robe, holding her expensive coffee cup. When she saw the agents swarming her perfectly manicured lawn, she let out a piercing shriek of horror. But the real agony for Sylvia was not the legal threat. It was the audience. Every single one of her elite wealthy neighbors, the doctors, the lawyers, the judges, she had spent 30 years desperately trying to impress, were standing on their porches watching the entire humiliating spectacle unfold. The same women she had aggressively excluded from her high society garden parties were now openly pointing and whispering from their driveways. Sylvia felt a physical pain in her chest as she watched the federal agents forcefully tape an official notice of seizure to her beautiful front door. Her pristine, untouchable image as the ultimate high society power couple was being publicly slaughtered. She tried to run back inside to hide her face from the gossiping neighbors, but an agent firmly grabbed her arm and shoved a heavy subpoena directly against her chest, citing her for massive tax fraud and international money laundering. At that exact same moment, clear across the city, Spencer was walking out of his luxury high-rise apartment, confidently carrying his gym bag and acting like he had successfully negotiated his way out of federal prison. He genuinely thought his secret plea deal had saved him. He smiled smugly at the doorman and stepped out onto the busy sidewalk. He was instantly surrounded by a completely different team of federal prosecutors and FBI agents. They handed him a massive stack of legal documents, notifying him that his supposed immunity deal was completely void. They loudly explained right there on the crowded sidewalk that they had received an anonymous delivery of an encrypted hard drive the night before. The drive contained undeniable proof that Spencer was not a victim of the church's embezzlement, but the absolute mastermind who had personally engineered the offshore shell companies. His arrogant smirk vanished instantly as the agents seized his passport and informed him that he was now the primary target of a massive racketeering investigation. But nobody was having a worse Wednesday morning than Devin. He had managed to post an exorbitant emergency bail just before sunrise, using the very last hidden credit line he possessed. Terrified, bruised, and absolutely vibrating with pure panic, he knew his entire life was over. The federal charges, the frozen accounts, the undeniable video evidence of his criminal trespass at my server farm. It was a mountain of ruin he could not talk his way out of. He completely abandoned his pregnant mistress without a second thought, leaving her asleep in their hotel room, while he packed a small duffel bag with whatever cash and expensive watches he could carry. He hailed a cheap taxi sitting in the back seat, smelling of cheap air freshener and old cigarette smoke, and ordered the driver to speed directly to O'Hare International Airport. The driver looked at him through the rearview mirror, disgusted by the frantic, sweaty man barking orders, but hit the gas anyway. Devin was sweating profusely, checking his phone every 5 seconds, darting his eyes around the crowded airport terminal like a hunted animal. He rushed to the international ticketing counter, trying to buy a first-class seat on the very next flight to a country that did not have a strong extradition treaty with the United States. He slapped his passport down on the counter, tapping his fingers aggressively and demanding the agent hurry up. The ticketing agent swiped his passport through the digital scanner and frowned. She scanned it again and a bright red alert instantly flashed across her monitor. She looked up at Devin and calmly pressed a hidden security button under her desk, telling him there was a slight issue with his travel clearance. Before Devin could snatch his passport back and run, 2 massive Transportation Security Administration agents stepped up directly behind him, placing their heavy hands firmly on his shoulders. They informed him that his passport had been officially flagged by the Federal Bureau of Investigation as an extreme flight risk. Devin completely shattered right there in the middle of the busy international terminal. His arrogant, entitled persona completely evaporated, leaving nothing but a terrified, weak little boy who had finally run out of places to hide. The agents dragged him into a sterile holding room while they waited for the federal marshals to arrive and take him into permanent custody. Left alone for just a few minutes with his phone, he did the only thing his broken mind could think of. He scrolled through his contacts with shaking, bloody fingers and called the one person who controlled the entire board. My phone buzzed loudly on the polished oak table. I was sitting in a highly secure, sleek corporate boardroom located high above the city skyline. The room was completely silent, except for the buzzing of my phone. I looked down at the screen and saw Devin's name flashing. I smiled slowly and pressed the green button, activating the speakerphone feature so the audio would carry crystal clear across the large room. "Valerie, please," Devin sobbed hysterically, his voice cracking and breaking into pathetic, high-pitched squeaks. "Please, you have to help me. They took my passport. They are coming to get me, and I have nothing left. I am so sorry, Valerie. I am so sorry for everything I did to you and to Miles. I was stupid. I was arrogant. I will do anything you want. I will sign over everything I have. I will confess to whatever they want me to say. Just please call off your lawyers. Please tell them to let me go. I cannot go to federal prison, Valerie. I cannot survive in there. You know I cannot. I am begging you on my hands and knees, please save me." He was hyperventilating, gasping for air, and crying so hard he was choking on his own tears. It was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool, smooth wood of the conference table. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the 4 stern-faced senior agents of the FBI Financial Crimes Unit who were sitting quietly around the table with me, their digital recorders active and their legal notepads open. I took a slow, deep breath, letting his pathetic sobbing echo off the glass walls before I finally spoke, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any mercy. "Keep talking, Devin. The agents are taking notes." Devin continued to beg and plead through the speakerphone, completely unaware that his every frantic word was being meticulously recorded by the federal agents sitting across from me. I simply tapped the screen to end the call and let the heavy silence of the corporate boardroom wrap around us. The net had completely closed around him, and the rest of the family was already suffocating under the crushing weight of the federal subpoenas that had rained down on them. They were trapped, but delusion is a terrifying and powerful disease. It was Saturday evening, just 3 days after the coordinated legal strike, and the entire city was loudly whispering about the imminent collapse of the bishop and his holy empire. Their bank accounts were frozen, their assets were being seized, and their faces were plastered across the local news channels. Despite this absolute apocalyptic reality, Sylvia was utterly determined to maintain her illusion of control. She was forcing the broken remnants of her shattered family to attend the prestigious annual Excellence in Leadership Gala. It was the most important social charity event of the season, and Sylvia truly believed that if they just showed up wearing custom couture and flashing confident smiles, the high society elites would ignore the federal investigations and the ugly rumors would magically disappear. She stood in the center of her heavily mortgaged master bedroom, aggressively zipping up a hysterical Alicia into a heavily beaded emerald evening gown. Alicia was sobbing uncontrollably, her face red and blotchy from days of intense panic attacks. Her husband Spencer was currently wearing a federal tracking monitor on his ankle, and her brother Devin was sitting in a federal detention center, but Sylvia did not care about reality. She roughly grabbed Alicia's chin, tilting her head up and aggressively applying thick layers of expensive concealer over her daughter's dark, tear-stained eyes. Sylvia hissed at her to stop crying and act like a woman of elevated status. She reminded Alicia that they had spent decades building this social dynasty, and she absolutely refused to let a few minor legal misunderstandings ruin their standing in the city. To Sylvia, optics and public perception were the only things that truly mattered in the world. She would rather watch her children mentally disintegrate in front of her than suffer the humiliation of hiding at home while the elite gossiped about their downfall. She shoved a heavy diamond bracelet onto Alicia's trembling wrist and ordered her to dry her tears and smile for the cameras, while Sylvia was busy painting a glamorous mask over her daughters. Complete mental collapse. I was across the city, standing perfectly still in my penthouse while my personal stylist made the final delicate adjustments to my gown. It was a custom-tailored floor-length crimson silk dress that draped perfectly over my frame. I did not need to wear heavy diamonds or aggressive makeup to prove my worth to anyone anymore. My power was absolute and entirely invisible. Elena. My security chief stood quietly by the grand double doors, holding my evening clutch and the sleek black folder containing the final financial transfer documents. My former in-laws were desperately attending this gala to project a fake aura of surviving wealth, but they had absolutely no idea that the very charity hosting the event had been on the verge of total bankruptcy just 2 weeks prior. The bishop had secretly drained their foundational funds, leaving them completely destitute. I was the one who had silently swept in and saved them. I was the anonymous diamond sponsor who had single-handedly funded the entire multi-million-dollar gala simply because I wanted to secure the absolute best seat in the house for the final act of this tragedy. The crisp night air was electric when my private car pulled up to the grand entrance of the Museum of Contemporary Art where the gala was being held. A massive crowd of photographers and local journalists were swarming the red carpet, aggressively shouting questions as the city's elite stepped out of their luxury vehicles. I arrived early and slipped quietly through a secure private side entrance, escorted directly to the VIP staging area behind the main ballroom. I sipped a glass of sparkling water and watched the live feed on the security monitors as my former family finally made their grand arrival. The bishop's black town car pulled up to the velvet ropes, and the camera flashes instantly exploded in a blinding, chaotic frenzy of bright white light. Sylvia stepped out first, her face pulled into a tight, terrifyingly artificial smile. She waved to the cameras with practiced elegance, completely ignoring the reporters who were loudly screaming questions about the IRS raids, the frozen accounts, and the federal subpoenas. The bishop followed closely behind her, looking gray and deflated, his usual booming holy charisma entirely extinguished by the crushing weight of his impending criminal trials. Alicia trailed behind them, looking like a terrified hostage in a designer dress, her eyes darting nervously around the aggressive crowd as if she expected the FBI to jump out from behind the velvet ropes and arrest her, too. They walked the red carpet projecting a pathetic, desperate illusion of unity and wealth. They walked into the grand ballroom holding their heads high, completely oblivious to the fact that they were walking directly into a perfectly designed trap. The ballroom was magnificent, filled with hundreds of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the city. Sylvia immediately tried to work the room, attempting to kiss cheeks and shake hands with the wealthy judges and politicians she used to casually control. But the room was completely freezing her out. People deliberately turned their backs as she approached, suddenly finding their champagne glasses incredibly interesting. The social isolation was palpable and deeply humiliating, but Sylvia just tightened her jaw and forced her family to take their seats at their assigned table near the front of the stage. They sat in rigid, miserable silence, trying desperately to pretend they still belonged there. As the extravagant dinner service concluded, the lights in the massive ballroom slowly dimmed, and a single bright spotlight illuminated the grand stage. The executive director of the charity stepped up to the crystal podium, tapping the microphone. The room fell completely silent as he began his emotional speech. He spoke about the incredible financial hardships the organization had recently faced, subtly hinting at the bishop's devastating betrayal, without explicitly naming him. Then his voice lifted with genuine immense gratitude as he announced that the charity had been miraculously saved from total ruin. He explained that an anonymous diamond sponsor had stepped forward to fund their entire operating budget for the next 5 years. Sylvia sat up a little straighter, desperately hoping it was one of her old allies coming to publicly save her reputation. The director smiled brightly and asked the crowd to direct their attention to the stage, to personally thank the visionary woman who had single-handedly preserved their foundation. The heavy velvet curtains parted slowly. The gentle classical music swelled through the hidden speakers. I walked calmly out into the blinding spotlight, the crimson silk of my dress flowing elegantly behind me. I stepped up to the microphone and looked directly down at the front row. The color instantly and completely drained from Sylvia's face, leaving her looking like an absolute corpse. The bishop dropped his silver fork onto his china plate with a loud clattering ringing sound. Alicia let out a quiet, choked gasp of pure terror. I smiled warmly at the crowd before locking my eyes entirely on my former family, ready to deliver the final nail in their coffins. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and heavy as I stood behind the crystal podium. The bright spotlight beat down on my shoulders, but I felt perfectly cool and entirely in control. I let the quiet stretch for a few deliberate seconds, letting the sheer shock of my presence fully marinate in the minds of the people sitting directly below me. I looked down at the center VIP table. It was the most expensive and prestigious table in the entire venue, situated right at the absolute edge of the stage. I had personally paid for every single chair at that table under my anonymous corporate holding company. And there they sat. My former husband Devon was slouching in his chair, his eyes darting frantically around the elegant room. He had miraculously managed to scrape together enough borrowed money to post his federal bail just hours before the gala, and Sylvia had clearly forced him into his tailored tuxedo to keep up their pathetic facade. His face was covered in small bandages from his disastrous encounter with the frosted glass window at my server farm. His hands were heavily wrapped in thick white gauze resting awkwardly on the white tablecloth. He looked like a beaten dog, completely stripped of his usual arrogant swagger. Beside him, Sylvia sat completely frozen, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were turning white. The bishop looked like he was struggling to breathe, his chest heaving under his crisp white dress shirt as he stared up at me in unadulterated horror. Alicia was trembling so violently that her heavy diamond earrings were shaking. Looking down at them from the elevated stage gave me a profound sense of poetic justice. My mind briefly drifted back to my very first holiday dinner with their family over a decade ago. I remembered sitting at their massive mahogany dining table wearing a simple off-the-rack dress that I had saved up for months to buy. I remembered how Sylvia had looked me up and down with absolute disgust before leaning over to the bishop and loudly whispering that I was entirely socially unfit to be sitting in their presence. Devon had simply laughed along with them, sipping his expensive champagne and telling me not to take it personally because I was just a simple girl who did not understand how high society operated. They had spent our entire marriage reminding me that I was an outsider, an uneducated peasant who should be endlessly grateful that they had allowed me to enter their elite religious circle. They had convinced themselves that without their Holy Family name, I would be completely invisible and irrelevant. Yet here I was standing in the blinding spotlight as the most powerful woman in the room, while they sat trembling in seats that my own money had purchased for them. I leaned into the microphone and let a soft, warm smile cross my face. Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I began, my voice echoing smoothly and clearly through the massive speakers. Thank you all for gathering here tonight to celebrate the core values that truly define our city. The theme of tonight's magnificent gala is excellence in leadership. It is a beautiful concept, but it is also a phrase that is thrown around entirely too casually by people who do not truly understand the profound weight of its meaning. I kept my tone perfectly poised and conversational, holding the massive crowd in the palm of my hand. Nobody in the audience knew who I was, but they were completely captivated by my presence, assuming I was simply a generous out-of-town philanthropist. I did not raise my voice or show even a hint of anger. I let my calm, absolute confidence fill the entire ballroom. True leadership is not about wearing expensive suits or demanding blind obedience from those who are vulnerable. I continued slowly walking out from behind the podium to stand at the very edge of the stage. True leadership requires absolute integrity, and above all else, it requires total transparency. I stopped walking and stood directly above the bishop's table, looking straight down into his terrified, sweating face. I let my eyes lock onto his, holding his gaze with a cold, terrifying intensity. We live in a world where transparency in corporate and religious leadership is often treated as an inconvenience rather than a moral obligation, I said, letting my words ring out over the silent crowd. We place our unwavering trust and our hard-earned money into the hands of charismatic men who stand at pulpits and podiums, promising to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. We believe their righteous speeches, and we trust their holy promises. But what happens when that sacred trust is violently betrayed? What happens when the very leaders who demand our weekly tithes and our absolute devotion are secretly operating in the dark? The bishop swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat rolling down his forehead and dripping onto his silk tie. Devon was physically shaking beside him, sinking lower and lower into his expensive chair, as if he was trying to become entirely invisible. Sylvia looked like she was going to have a sudden cardiac event, her breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I continued speaking smoothly, weaving my words like a delicate but deadly trap. The elite members of this city have always prided themselves on supporting noble charitable causes, I said, sweeping my gaze across the hundreds of wealthy faces in the audience. You write massive checks and attend beautiful galas just like this one, believing that your generosity is funding orphanages, building community centers, and feeding the hungry. But transparency is the only weapon we have against those who would exploit that beautiful generosity. A true leader does not hide their financial ledgers in the dark. A true leader does not funnel charitable donations through offshore shell companies. A true leader does not exploit their own congregation to fund a lavish, untouchable lifestyle while pretending to be a humble servant of the community. Every single word I spoke felt like a physical strike against the family sitting below me. The atmosphere in the room was beginning to shift as the wealthy patrons started to sense the underlying tension in my speech. They were hanging on to every syllable, completely unaware that they were about to witness the greatest public execution in the history of Chicago high society. I took a slow, deliberate step back from the edge of the stage, returning to the center of the spotlight. Tonight, we are going to redefine exactly what excellence in leadership truly means. I announced, my voice rising with absolute authority. We are going to shine a very bright light into the dark corners of this community and demand the transparency we have always deserved. To fully illustrate this vital point, I have prepared a very special visual presentation on the realities of religious and corporate accountability. I gestured gracefully toward the massive high-definition screens mounted on the walls all around the grand ballroom. Please direct your attention to the monitors, ladies and gentlemen. The gentle classical music suddenly cut out, leaving the room in a heavy, expectant silence. The massive screens flickered wildly for a split second before snapping to life. But they did not display a heartwarming video about the charity's good works. Instead, the screens populated with dozens of high-resolution images of the bishops, highly confidential offshore banking statements complete with exact routing numbers, forged signatures, and millions of dollars in stolen operational funds. The collective gasp that swept through the massive grand ballroom sounded like all the oxygen was instantly and violently sucked out of the room. Hundreds of the wealthiest, most influential people in Chicago stared up at the glowing high-definition screens in absolute stunned silence for exactly 3 seconds before the entire room completely erupted into pure, unadulterated chaos. They were looking at decades of undeniable, irrefutable proof of a massive criminal conspiracy displayed in brutal, terrifying detail. The screens automatically scrolled through page after page of highly confidential wire transfers showing exactly how the bishop had systematically drained the charity's operational funds directly into his own secret Cayman Island accounts. The images shifted to display Spencer's deeply arrogant and meticulously forged shell company documents, completely exposing how he had funneled the stolen congregation money through fake corporate entities to purchase Sylvia's designer wardrobes and Devon's luxury sports cars. The incredibly detailed ledgers left absolutely no room for interpretation or denial. I stood perfectly still at the center of the stage, letting the blinding hot spotlight wash over me as I watched the exact moment the social hierarchy of the city violently shifted. The elite community, the politicians, the wealthy congregants, and the powerful judges who had spent the last 10 years treating me like a disposable peasant suddenly realized they had been publicly conned by a family of common thieves. The action was immediate and brutal. Sylvia desperately reached out to grab the arm of a prominent state senator she had hosted at her garden party just last week, begging him to listen to her. The senator looked down at her manicured hand with absolute disgust, physically pulling his arm away and deliberately turning his back on her. It was a domino effect of pure social slaughter. Every single high society matron who had once kissed Sylvia's cheek and laughed at her cruel jokes about my background was now aggressively stepping away from the VIP table as if the family was carrying a highly contagious disease. They were physically turning their chairs and shielding their faces from the disgraced family, entirely eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. The people who had once told me I was completely socially unfit to sit at their tables were now openly sneering at my former in-laws, completely horrified by the staggering depth of their religious and financial hypocrisy. Sylvia let out a pathetic whimpering sound, collapsing back into her chair as she watched her entire carefully constructed social dynasty burn to ash in a matter of seconds. She clutched her heavy diamond necklace, gasping for air, as the devastating reality of her absolute ruin finally crushed her delusional mind. Alicia was openly sobbing, covering her face with her trembling hands, completely unable to handle the intense public humiliation of watching her wealthy friends turn against her in real time. But the bishop was not ready to surrender his holy crown just yet. Survival instinct and pure arrogant desperation violently kicked in. He suddenly bolted up from his chair, knocking his heavy china plate to the floor where it shattered into dozens of sharp pieces. His face was flushed a dangerous dark purple, and his eyes were wild with cornered panic. He pushed past the disgusted socialites and aggressively stomped up the side stairs of the stage, his heavy footsteps echoing over the loud murmurs of the crowd. He moved with a terrifying, unhinged energy, completely abandoning his practiced, holy demeanor. He stormed directly over to the secondary podium and roughly grabbed the spare microphone, his thick fingers gripping the plastic so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He started shouting over the panicked crowd, his booming voice vibrating with desperate fury. He aggressively pointed a thick finger at the glowing screens and loudly declared that the entire presentation was an elaborate, malicious cyber attack. He screamed that his family was being viciously targeted by digital terrorists and that every single document on the screen was a highly sophisticated deepfake designed to destroy his righteous, holy mission. He begged his loyal congregants and his wealthy friends to close their eyes and ignore the satanic lies being projected around them, demanding that they trust the man who had guided their souls for over 30 years. He insisted that the routing numbers were fabricated and that his offshore accounts were merely innocent missionary funds that had been digitally manipulated by enemies of the church. His voice cracked and broke as he desperately tried to project his usual charismatic authority, but he just sounded like a pathetic, terrified old man shouting at a storm he could not possibly control. The crowd was not buying a single word of his frantic, ridiculous performance. The boos and angry shouts from the elite audience only grew louder, completely drowning out his pathetic, holy excuses. Seeing his father utterly failing to regain control and watching the elite society actively reject them, something inside Devin completely snapped. The heavy federal subpoenas, the freezing holding cell, the destroyed server farm, and the sheer public humiliation of watching his ex-wife orchestrate his total annihilation finally broke his fragile, entitled mind. Devin let out a raw, guttural scream of pure, blind rage. He kicked his chair backwards so violently that it crashed heavily into the neighboring table, spilling expensive wine across the floor. Ignoring his heavily bandaged hands and his ruined, bruised face, he sprinted toward the center of the stage with a terrifying, unhinged momentum. His eyes were completely bloodshot and fixed directly on me. His face twisted into a mask of pure, violent hatred. He wanted to destroy the woman who had stripped him of his wealth, his pride, and his freedom. He lunged up the center stairs of the stage, completely intent on physically ripping the microphone out of my hands and tackling me to the polished wooden floor. I did not flinch, I did not scream, and I did not step back. I simply stood my ground in my crimson silk dress, watching him charge at me like a mindless rabid animal trapped in a corner. Devin was only 3 feet away from me, his hands reaching out to aggressively grab my shoulders, when a massive wall of solid black suddenly materialized from the heavy velvet curtains behind me. 3 large men, wearing heavy tactical gear and federal windbreakers, stepped smoothly out of the shadows, moving with terrifying synchronized precision. Devin did not even have time to register their sudden presence before the lead agent aggressively intercepted him mid-stride. The agent slammed his heavy shoulder directly into Devin's chest, completely killing his forward momentum and sending him crashing hard onto the polished wooden stage. Devin let out a pathetic, wheezing gasp as the wind was violently knocked out of his lungs. The 2 other agents immediately dropped to their knees, roughly grabbing Devin's flailing arms and forcefully twisting them behind his back. The loud metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing sharply through the open microphone completely silenced the chaotic ballroom. The bishop dropped his microphone in pure, stunned horror, watching his only son being violently restrained and handcuffed on the floor of the museum stage. Sylvia shrieked from the floor, completely losing whatever tiny shred of sanity she had left watching her golden boy treated like a common street criminal in front of the entire high society. I looked down at Devin, who was pressing his bruised, bleeding face against the cold wood, sobbing uncontrollably, in absolute defeat. The lead federal agent stood up slowly, adjusting his heavy tactical vest and brushing a piece of invisible lint from his dark sleeve. He stepped forward calmly, placing himself directly between me and the broken, pathetic remnants of the bishop and his golden son. The agent looked down at the disgraced family with absolute professional disgust before turning his head slightly toward me. His voice was perfectly calm, but it carried crystal clear across the silent, terrified ballroom. "We will take it from here, Mrs. Valerie," he said smoothly. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Devon's wrists with a sharp metallic snap that echoed loudly across the completely silent ballroom. The lead agent hauled Devon roughly to his feet, ignoring the pathetic whimpering noises escaping the broken man's throat. Devon hung his head, his ruined, bruised face dripping blood and tears onto his crisp white tuxedo shirt. It was a pathetic sight, but there was absolutely no pity left in that magnificent room. Before the crowd could even process the reality of Devon's violent takedown, 4 more heavily armed federal agents marched purposefully through the main ballroom doors. They did not care about the custom suits or the flowing expensive gowns they brushed past. They marched directly toward the front VIP table, where the bishop and Spencer were standing frozen in absolute terror. Spencer was the first to react, his survival instincts kicking in as he desperately tried to leverage his non-existent legal power. He held up his hands and stepped toward the approaching agents, his voice shaking as he frantically babbled about his protected immunity deal and his high-priced defense attorneys. The lead prosecutor simply reached into his dark jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of revoked immunity documents, shoving them aggressively against Spencer's chest. The agent flatly informed Spencer that his encrypted hard drive had exposed every single one of his offshore money laundering operations and that his immunity was entirely void. Spencer's arrogant face crumpled into a mask of pure defeated panic as an agent roughly grabbed his arms, pulling them behind his back and securing the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. The bishop tried a completely different tactic, relying on the holy authority that had protected him for 3 decades. He puffed out his chest and raised his booming voice, commanding the federal agents to unhand his family and threatening them with divine retribution. He loudly declared that he was a man of God and a pillar of the community, demanding that the agents show respect for his holy office. The lead FBI agent did not even blink. He simply grabbed the bishop's heavy shoulders, spinning the massive man around and forcing him face first against the edge of the expensive VIP table. The loud clatter of expensive china and crystal glasses crashing to the floor was the only sound in the room as the agent secured the cuffs around the bishop's wrists. The agent leaned in close and calmly informed the bishop that God was not going to save him from federal racketeering charges. The elite crowd completely lost their minds as the 3 men were forcefully marched toward the main exit. The charity photographers who had been hired to capture glamorous society moments instantly realized they were witnessing the greatest scandal in the history of the city. Camera flashes exploded in a blinding, chaotic storm of bright white light, illuminating the terrified, disgraced faces of Devon, Spencer, and the bishop as they were paraded through the ballroom in their custom-tailored tuxedos. The very politicians and judges who had eagerly eaten at their dinner table just last week were now openly pointing their phones at them, recording their absolute humiliating downfall. Sylvia watched the entire brutal spectacle unfold from her spot beside the shattered VIP table. She saw her golden son, her wealthy son-in-law, and her powerful husband being dragged out like common street criminals. The absolute crushing reality of her complete destruction finally broke through her thick layers of delusion. Sylvia let out a piercing, agonizing scream that shattered the remaining silence in the room. She collapsed heavily to her knees, hitting the polished wooden floor with a dull thud. Her custom emerald evening gown pooled dramatically around her legs, making her look like a broken, discarded doll. She sobbed hysterically, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks as she screamed that her entire life was over. She begged anyone to help her, to call the governor, to stop the cameras, to do anything to save her precious social status. But the elite society of Chicago is a brutal and unforgiving machine. The wealthy socialites and powerful executives standing near her literally took physical steps backward, shrinking away from her as if her failure was a deadly virus. The women she had spent decades trying to impress, the women she had brutally excluded from her garden parties, simply stood there in their diamond necklaces, staring down at her with cold, absolute disgust. Not a single person reached out a hand to help her up. Not a single person offered a word of comfort. She was completely, entirely alone, surrounded by an audience that was thoroughly enjoying her public slaughter. I watched the entire pathetic scene from my elevated position on the stage. My heart was perfectly steady, my breathing calm and even. I had waited years for this exact moment, and I was going to savor every single agonizing second of it. I slowly gathered the folds of my crimson silk dress and walked deliberately down the center stairs of the stage. The crowd parted for me instantly, stepping back to give me a wide, clear path as I approached the broken, sobbing woman on the floor. I stopped walking when the tips of my expensive heels were resting just inches from Sylvia's ruined emerald gown. She was gasping for air, her face buried in her hands, completely destroyed by the loss of the only thing she ever truly loved, which was her fake high society image. I reached into my small, elegant clutch and pulled out a pristine white tissue. I leaned down slowly, holding the tissue out to her. Sylvia looked up at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, her face twisted in absolute terror and devastating humiliation. She stared at the tissue, trembling violently. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, my voice cold and smooth, dropping the words directly into the space between us. "Apologize or leave, Sylvia, remember." The words hit her like a physical blow, recalling the exact cruel sentence she had hissed at me during that miserable holiday dinner years ago when she had tried to force me out of her house. She let out another choked, agonizing sob, completely unable to speak, completely unable to defend herself against the absolute finality of my victory. She was finally exactly where she belonged, on the floor beneath my feet. Alicia was standing completely still near the back of the room, having watched the entire horrific sequence of events unfold in absolute silence. She had watched her powerful husband dragged away in federal chains. She had watched her arrogant father and brother stripped of their dignity and paraded out in front of the flashing cameras. And now she was watching her mother crying alone on the floor, completely abandoned by the elite society they had sacrificed everything to conquer. Alicia looked up slowly, her tear-stained eyes finding mine across the crowded ballroom. There was no anger left in her expression, no arrogant defiance, and no more fake superiority. She just looked completely exhausted and entirely defeated. She held my gaze for a long, quiet moment, the heavy realization passing silently between us. She knew that I had orchestrated every single detail of this absolute massacre. She knew that she and her family had fundamentally underestimated the quiet girl they had tried to destroy. Alicia gave me a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of absolute surrender, a silent acknowledgement of my total, supreme victory, and a grim, terrified respect for the monster they had created. She did not look down at her mother, who was still sobbing hysterically on the floor, begging for someone to save her. Alicia simply turned her back on the shattered remnants of her family and walked quietly out the back doors of the ballroom, disappearing completely into the cold, dark night, leaving her mother entirely alone on the floor. 1 week later, the heavy steel doors of the Federal Detention Center in downtown Chicago slammed shut behind me with a loud, echoing clang that vibrated through the floorboards. The sound was a stark, brutal contrast to the soft classical music and the clinking crystal of the charity gala. But to me, it sounded like the beautiful ringing of absolute victory. I walked down the sterile concrete hallway, my expensive heels clicking with rhythmic, confident precision against the scuffed linoleum floor. My lead attorney, Marcus, walked quietly beside me, holding a slim black leather briefcase, his face a mask of strict professional indifference. The air in the facility smelled sharply of industrial bleach and stale sweat, a fitting environment for the people housed within its walls. We were led by a silent guard into a small, bleak visitation room divided entirely by a thick pane of smudged bulletproof glass. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, relentless buzz, casting a sickly, pale glow over the small metal table bolted to the floor on my side of the partition. I took a seat, smoothing the fabric of my tailored designer blazer, folding my hands perfectly in front of me, and waited in the suffocating silence. It did not take long. The heavy metal door on the opposite side of the glass buzzed loudly and swung open with a harsh mechanical grinding sound. A federal guard escorted Devon into the room. The sight of him was almost jarring, completely disconnected from the reality I had known for a decade. The man who had spent his entire adult life parading around the city in custom Italian suits, silk ties, and luxury watches was now wearing a standard-issue bright orange canvas jumpsuit. The fabric hung loosely and awkwardly on his frame, making him look small and insignificant. The bruising on his face from his disastrous encounter with the frosted glass window at my server farm had faded into an ugly yellowish purple, mapping out his violent failure across his cheekbones. His signature arrogant posture was entirely gone, replaced by a nervous, twitchy desperation that radiated from his every movement. He sat down heavily in the metal chair across from me, his bandaged hands trembling as he picked up the black plastic telephone receiver mounted on the wall. I slowly picked up the receiver on my side, bringing it to my ear, holding my expression in a state of absolute frozen calm. "Valerie." His voice crackled through the cheap plastic speaker, thick with manufactured emotion and desperate relief. "Thank God you came to see me. I knew you would come." He leaned closer to the glass, pressing his bandaged hand flat against the thick pane as if he could somehow reach through and touch me. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, desperately trying to summon the old, charismatic charm that had so easily fooled me all those years ago. "Valerie, please, you have to listen to me and understand what is happening here. I have had so much time to think sitting alone in that dark cell. I finally realized how completely blind and stupid I have been. I kept thinking about our first anniversary, when we rented that tiny, isolated cabin on the lake, before all the massive church money and the family expectations got in the way. We were so incredibly happy then, Valerie. We were just a normal couple, deeply in love and building a life. I want to go back to that time. I want to be the husband you married before my family ruined us." He let out a ragged, theatrical breath, trying to force a tear to fall from his bruised eye. "And Miles, God, I miss our son so much, it physically hurts my chest. I wake up every single morning on a steel cot, thinking about him, about his little laugh, and how desperately I need to be a real father to him. You cannot let him grow up with his father locked away in a federal prison. Valerie, you just cannot do that to our boy. Please, for the sake of Miles and the love we used to share, you have to talk to your lawyers. Tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. You have the money. Now you control the entire narrative. You can make this all go away, and we can be a real family again. Just you, me and Miles against the world." I sat perfectly still, listening to his pathetic, transparent attempt at emotional manipulation. It was the exact same psychological tactic he had weaponized against me for years. Whenever he had pushed me too far, whenever he had secretly drained our bank accounts, or dismissed my professional career, or happily let his mother publicly humiliate me in our own home, he would always pivot immediately to playing the romantic, misunderstood victim. He would bring up the early days of our relationship, painting himself as a flawed but deeply loving man who just needed my endless patience and forgiveness to become better. For a decade, I had foolishly believed him sacrificing my own sanity, my joy, and my self-worth to blindly hold together a family structure that never truly existed. I had spent years shrinking myself to fit into the tiny invisible box his elite family had built to contain me. But looking at him now through the thick, bulletproof glass, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering anger left in my chest, no residual sadness for the past, and certainly no mercy for his current predicament. He was just a broken, hollow man, wearing a bright orange suit, trying to play a manipulative game he had already permanently lost. I did not say a single word in response to his desperate romantic pleas. Instead, I calmly nodded to Marcus, who unclasped his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents. I took the heavy papers from him and smoothly slid them through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the glass partition. The heavy thud of the paper hitting Devon's side of the metal table made him physically jump in his chair. He looked down at the documents, his bloodshot eyes scanning the bold black lettering stamped across the top page. It was our final divorce decree, fully executed and permanently signed by a Supreme Court judge just that morning. Devon stared at the word dissolution, like he could not comprehend its definition, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. I finally spoke, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any emotion, carrying clearly through the receiver. Your romantic memories are exactly as fake as your offshore bank accounts. Devon, Miles and I are perfectly fine without you in our lives. In fact, we have never been better. Devon stammered, trying to push the heavy papers back toward the slot, but I continued speaking, cutting him off completely and effortlessly, dominating the space. You need to stop pretending to worry about me and start worrying about your own survival, because your precious, untouchable family has completely imploded. I let the harsh words hang in the cold air for a second before delivering the final fatal blows. The board of directors at the church held an emergency executive vote yesterday morning. They officially ousted your father without a single dissenting voice. The bishop has been permanently stripped of all his titles. His access to the ministry funds has been completely revoked, and the entire congregation is actively cooperating with the FBI to prosecute him for decades of gross financial abuse. Devon's jaw dropped open, his face turning a sickly shade of pale gray as he stared at me. But I was not finished tearing down his world. And if you were sitting in your cell, hoping your brilliant brother-in-law was going to magically save you with his elite legal connections, you are completely out of luck. Spencer took a federal plea deal late last night. He turned state's evidence to protect himself from a maximum sentence in a maximum security facility. He gave the federal prosecutors exactly what they wanted, handing over every encrypted hard drive and hidden ledger, and he specifically named you and your father as the primary architects of the international money laundering scheme. He completely threw you under the bus, Devon, and the federal prosecutors are happily preparing to bury you under it. And to make matters perfectly clear, the bank has officially foreclosed on the family estate. The massive, untouchable mansion that your mother prized above all else is currently sitting empty with heavy chains and bright federal seizure notices padlocked to the front gates. Your mother is currently sleeping on a cheap, stained sofa in a budget motel entirely alone and completely bankrupt. There is no money left, Devon. There is no dynasty left to inherit. There is no powerful family name to hide behind anymore. You have absolutely nothing. Devon stared at me through the thick glass, his mind completely short-circuiting as the absolute finality of his total destruction finally penetrated his thick skull. The grand illusion was dead. The long game was entirely over. His chest began to heave violently, and he dropped the plastic telephone receiver, letting it dangle by its metal cord and swing against the concrete wall. He buried his bruised face in his trembling, bandaged hands and began sobbing uncontrollably, his shoulders shaking as deep, pathetic wails echoed loudly through the small, sterile room. He sounded exactly like a terrified, lost child, begging the universe to somehow rewind the clock and undo his monumental arrogance. I watched him cry for a few silent, steady seconds, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound, permanent closure. I had completely dismantled the toxic elite machine that had tried to consume and destroy me, and I had emerged completely untouchable. I slowly stood up from the cold metal chair, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer and buttoning it with calm, practiced precision. Through the thick, bulletproof glass, I could faintly hear him screaming my name, sobbing and begging for forgiveness, for mercy, for a second chance, for anything to stop the pain. I did not flinch, and I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply turned on my heel and walked purposefully toward the heavy steel door, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete floor, leaving his pathetic, desperate apologies echoing endlessly in the cold, empty room. 6 months later, the morning sunlight poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office. The view of the Chicago skyline was absolutely breathtaking, stretching out for miles in every direction. The sprawling high-tech commercial building was not a corporate lease or a rented suite. It was the exact same derelict building my grandfather had left me in his will, completely transformed into the multi-million-dollar global headquarters of my technology firm. The exposed brick walls and polished concrete floors blended perfectly with the sleek minimalist glass desks and high-end server arrays humming quietly in the background. It was a space entirely of my own making, purchased with my own money, and designed exactly to my own specifications. I stood near the window holding a warm cup of coffee, watching the busy city streets below. The sheer, absolute contrast between this moment and my life a year ago was profound. A year ago, I would have been rushing to make sure the bishop's breakfast was perfectly prepared while simultaneously checking Devon's dry cleaning and making sure Sylvia's morning tea was exactly the right temperature. I would have been mentally preparing myself for another full day of passive-aggressive comments about my clothes, my background, and my general inadequacy. I would have been shrinking myself, making myself small and quiet, and completely agreeable, just to maintain the fragile peace in a house that actively despised my very existence. I turned away from the window and looked toward the center of my massive office. Miles was sitting on a thick, fluffy rug, happily building a complicated tower out of colorful wooden blocks. He was completely relaxed, babbling softly to himself as he carefully balanced a bright red block on top of his unsteady creation. There was a peaceful, quiet joy in him that had never been allowed to exist in the bishop's cold, oppressive mansion. He was no longer forced to sit perfectly still in uncomfortable tailored suits, or told to stop laughing because he was disturbing his grandfather's holy meditations. He was just a little boy, allowed to be loud and messy, and completely happy in a space where he was absolutely unconditionally loved. I walked over and sat down on the edge of the rug beside him, running my hand gently through his soft hair. He looked up at me with a massive, gap-toothed smile before turning back to his wobbly wooden tower. A sleek, flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of the office was playing the local morning news softly in the background. The news anchor was speaking in a serious, practiced tone, and the graphic running across the bottom of the screen caught my eye. The bishop and his family had been the lead story in Chicago for the past 6 months, and today was the final chapter. I reached for the remote on my desk and turned the volume up just a fraction. The screen displayed a stark, humiliating courtroom sketch of the bishop standing before a federal judge. The anchor announced that the former religious leader had been officially sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for massive racketeering, fraud, and money laundering. The sketch showed him looking small and deflated, his holy arrogance completely stripped away by the harsh reality of a heavy federal sentence. The broadcast quickly shifted to a photo of Devon being led out of the courthouse in handcuffs. He had received a 5-year sentence for his direct involvement in the shell companies and wire fraud. His golden boy status had not saved him, and his expensive defense attorneys had failed to secure the leniency he had arrogantly expected. Spencer, the brilliant lawyer who had turned state's evidence, received 3 years of probation and was permanently disbarred, completely banned from practicing law ever again. The news segment concluded with a brief, humiliating update on Sylvia, the woman who had spent decades reigning over Chicago high society, wearing custom designer gowns and demanding absolute respect from the city's elite, was now entirely bankrupt. The federal government had seized every single asset the family owned, including her precious jewelry collection and her beloved luxury vehicles. She had been forced to move into a tiny, modest apartment on the outskirts of the city and was currently working as a mid-level retail associate at a mid-tier department store just to make rent. The women she had brutally excluded from her garden parties now occasionally walked past her makeup counter, pretending not to recognize the disgraced fallen matriarch. I listened to the entire broadcast, watching the final total destruction of the family that had tried to destroy me. But as the news anchor moved on to the next segment discussing the local weather patterns, I realized something profound. I did not feel any petty joy. I did not feel a rush of vindictive satisfaction or a desperate need to gloat over their absolute ruin. I just felt absolute total peace. It was a deep, quiet stillness that settled directly into my bones. For 10 years, I had lived in a constant state of high alert, navigating their toxic landmines and desperately trying to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of seeing it. I had let their cruel words dictate my value and their arrogant dismissals define my reality. But I had also spent those 10 years quietly pouring the heavy concrete foundation of my own success. I had built my technical empire in the shadows, saving my money, securing my assets, and fortifying my independence brick by quiet brick. When the massive, devastating earthquake of their betrayal finally hit, they had fully expected me to be completely crushed beneath the falling debris. They had expected me to shatter into a million helpless pieces. But because I had built my foundation on my own terms, my house was the only one left standing. I walked over to the large glass windows and slowly reached for the heavy automated controls. With a soft mechanical whir, the thick blinds smoothly descended, shutting out the view of the busy city and the faint reflection of my past life. The quiet hum of the servers and the soft, happy babble of my son, filling the sunny room, were the only sounds left in my world. They told me to leave, so I did. I left their toxicity, their arrogant entitlement, and their endless suffocating lies. I walked away from the fake holy dynasty and the miserable golden cage they had tried to lock me inside. I took my hard-earned peace. I took my beautiful son, and I took back my absolute power. And I never looked back. The greatest lesson here is that true power never comes from seeking validation from toxic people who are determined to misunderstand you. It comes from quietly building your own foundation and knowing your absolute worth when they try to tear you down. You do not owe loyalty to a family that only uses you to feed their own arrogance. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply walk away and let their lies destroy them. Share your story in the comments if you have ever escaped a toxic situation to find peace, and subscribe today for more powerful stories.